This segment of From the Beginning, the Mayer Museum of Art at Randolph College, describes how the college was one of the first institutions in this country to focus on American art, and describes the opportunities that we offer our students. Every object has a backstory, and here we learn about some of them.
The American Art Collection at Randolph College is really an incredible collection. I remember the first time I saw it, I was in graduate school studying American art at the University of Virginia, and I knew that there was an important American art collection here, but I really didn't know that much about it. And I believe in part that's because this was really before the age of the internet, because this was in the very beginning of the 1990s. And I and a friend were invited to come here to hear a lecture by a very eminent American art historian, David Lubin. And when we were here, of course, we took a tour from room to room, and literally our eyes kept getting wider and wider. We would walk into a room and say, oh my gosh, there's Vanderlyn. Oh my gosh, they have a Thomas Cole. They have a Georgia O'Keeffe. They have a Hopper. And we just kept saying things like that all through our visit to the museum. And I think it's really inspiring to think that this was one of the first college collections to focus on American art. And this collection began doing so in the very first years of the 20th century. And that was at a time when American art was often not valued, or it was often thought to be too derivative of European art models.
To have real works of art to study is, again, a difficult thing to put into words, because we are so used to seeing images all the time, images on the phone, images on the television. These are merely digital simulacra of actual works of art. And no matter how good your photograph is, it will never replicate the experience of seeing a work of art in person.
Each artist in the collection addresses important questions about how we live in contemporary society. What kind of questions are important to us, what kind of barriers we create for each other to the achievement of a good life.
Alfred Stieglitz, the pioneering photographer and husband of Georgia O'Keeffe, had a number of avant-garde galleries in New York City. First, a gallery called 291, named for its address on 291 Fifth Avenue. And then later his gallery was called An American Place. And a number of the modernist works in the collection from the early 20th century are by artists that were part of Alfred Stieglitz's stable, so to speak, artists represented by him in his gallery. And a lot of these works were sold by Stieglitz to the museum. For instance, the John Marin landscape, Taos Mountain, was purchased directly from the Stieglitz Gallery. And there's a wonderful letter from Alfred Stieglitz to Professor von Keller, who was the head of the art department at the time, in which he expresses his delight that the painting has entered the college's collection. He mentions that he believes that there's no other Marin in the entire state of Virginia, and he says that your college is a center of enlightenment for young women.
I first came to the college on an interview for a job. I was living in New York, Lower Manhattan, for 20 years as an artist, and decided to teach. And I interviewed at a number of places, but it really was the Mayer Museum of Art that convinced me that I could be here. One of the reasons I say that is when asked about how to talk about art, Cezanne said the only proper place to talk about art is in front of art. And I knew I could have an authentic experience with my students if we could have a collection like this to talk with in front of. And I started as a painter 50 years ago, and one of my favorite artists in my pantheon was Albert Pinkham Ryder, who painted very few paintings, and he was a visionary artist, more of an evocative artist than a depictive artist. He was outside of his time, and yet he was one of the most popular artists among other artists. And I came to visit the mayor, and I went around that corner over there, and there was a painting of Albert Pinkham Ryder, The Country Girl. And I thought, if you're here, I can be here.
The breadth of this collection that we have for teaching American and contemporary art is really extraordinary.
Another really valuable thing about this collection is many of the paintings by the most famous American artists have a particular interest or a unique quality that examples of their work in even larger collections may not have. For example, the O'Keeffe painting of the yellow cactus is smaller than a lot of O'Keeffe paintings of flowers, so maybe you wouldn't pay enough attention to it at first, but it's really worthwhile of a close look, a closer scrutiny, because even though it's small in size, it's very carefully painted. It's also got a really tactile quality that a lot of O'Keeffe's big floral paintings don't have. If you think of something like her calla lily paintings or her black irises, those works, even though very large in scale, often have a kind of slick surface. But the yellow cactus painting is very tactile. There are parts of the painting where the paint is more lightly applied to the canvas. You can almost see the weave of the canvas coming through. But there are other parts of the painting where she's much more heavily layered the paint, giving it a three-dimensional quality. And she's particularly done that in the depiction of the stamens of the flowers. And it gives the work not only a great visual interest, but it gives it a real textural interest too. It's really a very beautiful painting, and it's no wonder that her husband Stieglitz then described it as a rare O'Keeffe, a rare one of the rare ones.
The collection also has attracted faculty of extraordinary caliber, and it brings visiting artists and visiting scholars of international reputation, and those two are experiences that can't be equaled in any other way. And for a small faculty of 4 full-time professors, having visiting artists and scholars greatly broadens the experience we can give to students.
The Mayor's Winslow Homer painting, Paris Courtyard from 1867, is another interesting example of having perhaps an offbeat work by a major American artist, because Homer is certainly one of the greatest of all American artists, and certainly, in my opinion at least, he's the greatest watercolorist that America has ever produced. But Homer was in France in 1867. He actually went there to see some of his own paintings in the Paris Universal Exposition that year. His major work about the Civil War, Prisoners from the Front, was being shown in the exhibition. So he went to see that and also look at art and also go out in the country for a bit. And we know he lived in Paris for a while, at least, while he was in France, but there's a lot about Homer's trip to France that is not well known. And the works that he produced in Paris have actually engendered a lot of scholarly debate. And Paris Courtyard is rather a curious little work of Homer's, but it also has attributes that make it an interesting Homer, and also a Homer that has something in common with some of his other works of the 1860s. For example, the female figure who's in the center of the painting is a figure that Homer used a number of times in other paintings and in some of his graphic works, because at the time Homer was still supplementing his income from selling oil paints by still doing illustrations for the Illustrated Weekly magazines. So that figure pops up a lot in Homer's art, and that's something that you see in Homer a lot in the 1860s.